I'm on? Okay, good. All right. Thank you. Well, I'm sorry to be late. I had what for those of us who have difficulty seeing, was a major catastrophe late this last week, which I lost my glasses. And they were very good. They were very accurate. And I have probably a dozen old glasses, but they tended not to be very good. So I've been looking all over yesterday and today before church. So that's what made me late. That's the only excuse I have. We have two more sessions today and next Sunday. And I've debated a lot what approach I should take. And I decided um, I'm going to talk today about Charles Darwin and evolution. And I hadn't intended to spend the whole session on it, but I'm going to go deeper than most people do, and probably deeper than you might have heard in another position. I mean, another presentation. Um, so I'm going to talk about the consequences of Darwinism for the 20th century and even for science today. Um, and then next week, I'm going to talk briefly about how evangelical Christians reacted to this. And then I'm going to talk just briefly about the nature of science and belief in the 20th century. Having put together a couple of books on science and religion, I've read more than I ever thought I would very many years ago. But science has changed society, American society, but society everywhere in the world. And it's made it more complex. And it's interesting to me in the last few years to see how many of the old views reappear, especially when some very famous Darwinists argue that Christianity is bunk, that only science explains life, and if we don't get with it, we're behind times. Um, and nobody in this church believes that, but some of your neighbors do, especially in a university country like today, a university situation like today. So let's open an word of prayer, shall we? Father, thank you that we're here to worship, that we enjoy a freedom which many people throughout the world don't, of coming to honor you, to preach your word, sing your praises, and to learn about you. I pray that you will bless our discussion today. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, let me go back a little bit. Historians are always going back because they don't know the future, but they know the past pretty well. In the 18th century, a whole new movement in European society broke out. It was called the period of the Enlightenment, in which the proponents of new ideas claimed to be enlightened, as opposed to the rest of the people who weren't. The, the seedbed of this was France. France in the 18th century produced some very radical philosophers who attacked Christianity and argued that only reason or empirical science could explain the world as we see it. Their names aren't very well known. The chief propagandist, Voltaire, is probably best known, but it was people earlier than him that developed these ideas. And ideas that begin, especially in philosophy, take a long time to filter down to ordinary people like you and me. But they tend to form the spirit of the age, as we call it. The spirit of the age is that general pattern of thought which intellectuals and distinguished people hold, and which they present in a variety of ways, especially in universities, and gradually they filter down to most people. And that's what we live in today, a society whose philosophy of life or of science or of the world tends to be, or was until the day before yesterday, probably the dominant one, not among church people, not among ordinary people, but among the thinkers who formulate the chief thoughts in society. That Enlightenment philosophy began in the 18th century, and it began very early to help set a background for the development of natural science. Now, it seems strange to us to say that the science of the mid 18th century, even of the early 19th century, that is 200 years ago, was that of Aristotle. Aristotle, who lived in the fifth century, I'm sorry, the sixth century BC, in the fifth century, was one of the great geniuses of the ancient world, and He founded a school at Athens, the first philosophical school that was founded, called, well, it was nicknamed the School of the Peripatetics. If you're peripatetic, that means you enjoy walking. And Aristotle was a lecturer, and he walked across the courtyard from one end to the other with his scientists, I'm sorry, with his students behind him, and he would give lectures off the cuff. And then he wrote them down, mostly as lecture notes. And he became very influential on science, on other fields as well, but on science. And Aristotle during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and Reformation was the chief philosopher, especially in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church today holds him as the greatest philosopher. And if you go to seminary, you spend a lot of time learning the thought forms that were introduced by Aristotle. Well, in the 18th century, it wasn't Aristotle. He was the chief philosopher in the Middle Ages, but it was people who took a more mechanistic approach. And that paved the way for developments of the idea of naturalism, or as we would call it today, evolutionism in some form. In astronomy, Laplace, I'm sorry, I have trouble reading my notes with these glasses. They worked 2 years ago, but they don't work today. The spirit of the Enlightenment was largely formulated by people like Laplace, who turned first of all to the solar system and suggested natural cosmogonies, that is, means of explaining the birth of the solar system. And some of these ideas began to be applied to geology. We call the people who are in charge of more earthbound sciences naturalists, and I'll call them that. They weren't scientists. There was no word, not even a real understanding of what we would call science. But they began to argue that discoveries of fossils that had been made, especially as they were made earlier in the 19th century, suggested that there was such a thing as comparative anatomy. That is, that animals had changed over time, and that some species had been discovered in ancient times that were unlike those same animals today. In other words, their structure had changed. And this was fitted early on in the Aristotelian model. The problem was that there wasn't much of a place for that in Aristotle's model. But the person who began to apply some of these new finds of rock hunters, primitive geologists in the early 18th century, began to apply them to comprehensive discovery of the nature of mankind. The first person to do this was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he formulated the first comprehensive theory of what was called transformationalism, the idea that animal life could go from one form to another. Later, that became known as evolution. And Lamarck argued that animals' body parts could change during their own lifetime and depending on the extent to which it used them. And that idea, use or disuse of organs and muscles, frequently became larger or changed in some sense, but seldom tended to shrink. Now, according to Lamarck, acquired traits became hereditary, the changes that occurred in one species. And this idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics influenced many people for several generations. Later, after Darwin, discoveries tended to disprove this theory, but interestingly enough, there's still today, even in an evolutionary word, some Lamarckians whose theories have been a bit revived. Maybe they've never really gone under. But in the 18th century, the latter half of the 18th century, evolutionary ideas, as we can call them that, transformational ideas became popular. And we usually associate evolution with Darwin, but in fact, they appeared in earlier writers. In fact, Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, who died in 1802, was of a nature transformationalist who conceived some of the ideas that later were attributed to his son. Um, and these his attempts were attempts to apply some of the theories of Lamarck to his own century. Another in 1844 was Robert Chambers, who published a book called Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, in which he traced a process of what we would call today evolutionary change. Now, the idea of Aristotle was that all species were fixed, that they didn't change. And until Darwin, most naturalists accepted the Aristotelian view. What changed Darwin's mind, because he was interested in what we would call geology today, um, even when he was a young man, he decided to take on a voyage of discovery aboard a ship that sailed in 1831. It was HMS Beagle, and it spent 5 years traveling around the world. That's quite a sacrifice of one's life to go all around the world looking for species of life. And the ship made a call in South America on the eastern side. Um, and Darwin collected a number of specimens of plants and animals and made extensive notes of flora and fauna. Um, he was especially influenced by what he found in a variety of species on the Galapagos Islands. They're located in the eastern Pacific coast, off the coast of Ecuador, about 605 miles off the coast. And there he found striking differences between species. That is, species that um, differed from island to island. And these islands were not very far apart. Um, Darwin was influenced by a couple of writers whom he'd read before he started on his voyage. Um, and one was Charles Lyell, the man who climbed Mount Etna for many years in Sicily looking for fossils, and who had introduced the theory of what came to be known as uniformitarianism. I think I talked about that last week. That is, whether the Earth's surface was formed by natural processes rather than acts of fiat creationism, and that they took place over a long period of time. That was the beginning of Darwin's idea that just as fossil formations showed a variety of early forms of life that had developed over a long period of time, the same thing might be applied to Earth. That is, to changes that occurred in populations. And he was very influenced by a man named Thomas Malthus, who also was a naturalist, but also a demographer, and who predicted that the growth of population would always exceed the resources available on Earth. And therefore, they would outrun the food supply. And he thought that this would cause crises in populations, not only of animals, but of men. And the search for new resources, food and the like, would cause wars and revolutions and real problems. Anyway, influenced by that, the influence of changes in the area in which we live, a variety of other things, suggested to Darwin that that might explain changes in human beings. So in 1859, years after he returned, Darwin published one of the most famous and epoch-making books in the history of Western civilization, The Origin of Species. Came out in 1859, and in it, Darwin suggested several things that he believed were important factors in evolutionary change. One was random variation. That is, in human populations, there were changes in individual species, and that the strong tended to emerge as the dominant ones. What he called natural selection. Nature does all the work. And he picked up the idea from Malthus that there's intense competition for resources on Earth. Is that true? Well, certainly. The outbreaks of a number of wars, including World War I, had been a search for new lands on which to settle. And intense competition, war, human human competition, he believed that a slight variation might give an advantage to certain people or certain populations, and those positive ones, the negative ones would be eliminated naturally, but the positive ones would help them in the struggle for life. The struggle for life. That was a leading factor in Darwin. Um, and he said the organisms that provide favorable traits help them in that struggle. Um, and the unfavorable ones simply die out. So a series of species that can adapt to its environment would tend to avoid extinction. And although Darwin didn't call it that, his friend Herbert Huxley, who styled himself the bulldog of Darwin, made a strong attack on alternate views and held the views that Darwin had presented. Um, and it was Herbert Huxley who called this theory of Darwin the survival of the fittest. Those who best adapt to their locale are able to survive, and those who can't die out. And Darwin argued that over a long period of time, the reduction and eventual elimination of less favorable variations brought about a gradual transformation of species. Now, he had no way of explaining how that happened, why it led to a gradual transformation of species. That came later. Darwin knew that he faced an overwhelming series of odds against his views being accepted. He was worried about the religious reaction. Darwin was married to a very fine Christian woman who had always worried about her husband's radical ideas, and he didn't want to hurt her feelings. Um, he wasn't much cared about mainstream naturalists because new discoveries were things that they often did themselves. Um, on hearing that another person had uh, come up with his theory of survival in nature, he decided he would go public with his book earlier than he had expected. And that person was Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace was not an he was not an agnostic as Darwin was, and Darwin decided he would rush his book into print. Those of you who are in the sciences know that getting there first counts. That person was Alfred Russel Wallace. Darwin published it first, and therefore those who believed in evolution came to be called Darwinians and not Russellites. I don't know, whatever they would have been named if Wallace had set it forth. Um, Wallace was like Darwin. He was a very broadly trained person. He was a naturalist, explorer, geographer, anthropologist, and biologist. And he was a person who had come to some of the same ideas as Darwin, but a little bit differently. He thought also that natural selection was the way of explaining the idea of evolution. But he was I don't think we quite know what his religious views were. Some people say he was a spiritualist. Some people say he was perhaps a liberal form of Christian, but he did believe in a spiritual world. And he didn't believe that purely naturalistic factors were what counted. So in 1859, just before Christmas, I think it was, Darwin published his book On the Origin of Species. I used to own a copy, but I found it unreadable, so I gave it away. But it's very detailed. It's a definite scientific work, and it's built on the ideas that Darwin had and that he believed were confirmed by his exploration of naturalism. He wanted to gain priority, and he did. His book was very popular among people who were willing to read deeply in science. And so he gained credit for evolution over Wallace. Now, from here, the story, fairly simple so far, gets a bit complex. Did everybody accept Darwin's ideas? No. Did the majority of people accept them right away? No. England in 1859 was still a very Christian country. Uh, the result of a number of things, some very distinguished theologians in England and even more in Scotland who had formulated solid grounds for the Christian faith. And also the influence of the Anglican Church in England, which was largely evangelical in the 19th century. Uh, Widespread revivals through the British Isles. They all made England very much a Christian country. If you can use that term, I hate to say a Christian country, but I mean the thinking was very influenced by clergymen, by Queen Victoria, certainly, who was a fine Christian. And so the usual view that Darwin was criticized by Christians of all denominations is simply wrong. It's a myth. But both the scientists and ordinary people disagreed among themselves. Some scientists rejected Darwin for scientific reasons. Um, a number of ministers accepted because they didn't see strong theological objectionable issues. And this has been said. I read an article that says that in 1860, 1 year after its publication, a survey indicated that more clergymen accepted Darwinian ideas than naturalists did. Now, is that possible? Well, it is, because in the 19th century, many clergymen um, had naturalism as a hobby. Some of them, especially in little country parishes where they preached twice a week and visited their people, but otherwise had not very much to do. They were nearly all graduates of Oxford and Cambridge, and many of them were quite learned. And it was an old tradition in England that clergymen would have hobbies, not collecting coins or baseball cards, but studying what we would call the natural sciences. And some of the outstanding works on science in the early 19th century were published by Anglican clergymen. And that was similar in Scotland. Scotland was always a country of great learning of the clergy. Uh, they were Calvinists, and Calvin put a lot of emphasis on God's creation as a proof of his transcendental characteristics. So it's interesting that some scientists rejected Darwin, some Christians accepted him, and maybe that's even the case today. But some ministers didn't see any real objectionable facts. And in America, because his ideas spread very rapidly, as ideas tended to spread from Western Europe to America in the 19th century, a number of well-known scientists accepted Darwin, and a number of well-known scientists rejected him. And I'll just give you one or two examples. One of the best-known Americans was a man who was named Louis Agassiz. He was Swiss, and he was a Swiss American. He moved to the States. He became a well-known professor at Harvard, and he rejected Darwin's view. And in fact, in those days, if you had disagreements with fellow scientists, you often tried to settle the issues by correspondence. And he corresponded with Darwin. It was a polite correspondence. And some scientists who were Christians were concerned that Darwin had deprived human beings of our spiritual element. That is, by making them animals, in essence, closer to the animal, what we would call the animal kingdom. But the theory had opponents. Some people argued that Darwin had reduced the human race to animals, and they that they were the products of natural selection. Natural selection was the means by which this occurred. It occurred in nature without any overarching providential idea that had been introduced by God. If that was the case, if we as human beings had emerged from animal life, then what was the difference? What was the difference between human beings and animals? Um, and Many Christians believe that by rejecting a Christian worldview, Darwin uh, had done away with the, the theology of the Christian faith. Um, Darwin always protested that he was not an atheist. Atheism was emerging in England at this time by a number of people, often by scientists, who thought that they had an ally in Darwin. And Darwin always refused to claim that he was an atheist. He didn't. He was a naturalist. He claimed to be an agnostic in religion. Was there a God or not? Well, he didn't know. But he, in fact, never announced that he was an atheist. Um, but he did hold that the changes which had led to human beings today with rational abilities was purposeless. There had been no one who had been in charge providentially of evolution, um, and that all the results were accidental change. Do human beings come from accident? Well, Darwin believed that that was the case. Um, it's interesting because he had a long period of development. As a young man, he was raised as a Christian. He even considered, he tells us in his autobiography, of becoming a minister. Um, but his views gradually changed over time. But what produced his final abandonment of Christianity was that his beloved daughter Annie died at the age of 10. And that was in 1851. It's fairly late in his thinking. And he just didn't believe that a gracious God could allow a man's favorite daughter to die at the age of 10. It's happened in many cases. The death of someone in, especially a close member of your family, a spouse or child, can often change people's view and often their view of God. Um, so by the time he published The Origin of Species, and that was in 1859, he'd become a materialist. That is, he didn't believe there was any supernatural order. Everything could be explained naturally. And um, he always maintained to the end of his life that he was not atheist, that he was an agnostic. And it's interesting. Do you know what a colporteur is? Pastor, do you know? You've heard the term. Colporteur is somebody who goes door to door selling books. When I was a boy in the early 50s, we had people coming by, mostly selling vacuum cleaners, but we had one or two who were selling the Book of Knowledge or the World Book Encyclopedia. That was quite common. And there was a woman who was a colporteur who came several times to visit Darwin and to bring Christian books, and who very politely debated with him, attempting to lead him to the Christian faith. But by the time he published The Origin of Species, he'd become a materialist. An agnostic, he always claimed, but not an atheist. And he publicly wrote letters claiming that he didn't agree with atheists who sometimes quoted Darwin because they believed that his natural selection theory had supported their view. One friend who did, however, was Thomas Huxley. Thomas Huxley was a close friend of Darwin, and he he was the one who was a kind of what shall I say? He argued for Darwinism and often had better arguments for it than Darwin did. Um, he was the one who um, he called himself Darwin's bulldog because he was quite fierce, but he coined the term "the survival of the fittest." It was never used by Darwin, and it was an attempt to coin a term that would explain Darwin's um, belief in a competition of the species. Um, but Aristotelianism was dealt a real blow by Darwin, but it was already in its largely death knells as the method of science by Darwin's publication. And he rejected what was part of an Aristotelian worldview in teleology. Teleology says that the cause and effect relationship is headed for an end. What's the end? Well, eventually it's the human species. How did human beings come? It was by the teleological development of earlier animal forms. Darwin absolutely rejected teleology, as any Christian would accept it. Maybe science would be Aristotelian, but his belief in teleology also fitted in with the idea of the eternity of immortal souls. Um, so Darwin said evolution happens, but it isn't progressive anywhere. Um, it doesn't. It's not worked by God. God doesn't use it to develop us toward a particular end. Everything happens by chance. Um, One critic in England called it, and this was a naturalist, the law of higgledy-piggledy, which is a nice term, isn't it? Where does evolution end? Does it end with the teleology of the human species? No, we don't know where it will end. It's all a matter of unplanned nature. Um, why then did it spread? Well, it's interesting that it spread among Christians and non-Christians, among Protestants and Catholics. There was one Catholic who was a strong believer in Darwinism, and he had to fight with bishops and even with the Pope over that. And he eventually was excommunicated from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was not initially in favor of it, but many Protestant clergymen were. Now, they managed to merge a biblical view of creation of human beings by evolution. The only difference was from the traditional Christian view, they argued that God had used evolutionary creation to create Adam and Eve. Well, all this was going on for a decade between 1859 and 1970. And so Darwin decided to publish a separate volume on human evolution, and it was called The Descent of Man, published in 1871. So this would have been 13 or 14 years after The Origin of Species. And here he laid his cards on the table, so to speak. He argued that natural moral values, and let me say that moral values were the results of social instincts that had been developed by natural selection. Can you square that with a biblical view? Absolutely not. That was his view. They were built into human beings because our ancestors lived in groups, um, and moral codes forbade things like murder or lying. And they were just the product of a herd instinct. You must have heard that maybe in school. Herd instinct, and they were designed to protect the social group. Why do you make murder a moral issue? Well, because you don't want your son or daughter killed by someone, and that tends to be a natural view to this day. Um, Moral codes that forbade lying or stealing also were designed to protect the social group that they gave rise to. Was there a spiritual element? Were the Ten Commandments God's commands? No, not because Darwin didn't believe in God, but he had a naturalistic explanation for everything. And that perhaps is the greatest thing that Christians would disagree with. Did God use evolution to bring Adam and Eve to the Garden of Eden? Well, we might say yes. Some Christians would say yes. But are the Ten Commandments the result of just an attempt to provide a rationale for things that we don't want done? No, that's also a matter of evolutionary unplanned instincts, I guess. They were herd instincts, and they were designed to protect the social group. Um, there was no spiritual element in evolution, not at all. Um, in fact, Darwin's views went back not in the way he enunciated them, but in the rationale behind them. I'm cleaning out my library. One of the hardest things I've ever done. I guess I have several thousand books, and I have some people that I've said they could have some if they wanted, especially some of my students. When I get together with some of my students of past years, we spend half the evening discussing ideas. And I came across this book written in the late 40s and was a very influential book in the 1940s and 50s, and it's become a classic. It's called Ideas Have Consequences. Have any of you read it? Have you heard of it? Well, have you? I've started to read it. I haven't got very far, but it's a brilliant book. written by a professor at the University of Chicago. Ideas have consequences, do they? Yes. Francis Schaeffer popularized the idea, which has been very influential on my thinking, that um, the origin of so many things in that are good or that are bad are ideas that influence us, and they're collections of ideas that come with generations. Freud introduced a whole series of ideas. I think many of them have had bad consequences. All the great thinkers have provided a justification for the way we think. And sometimes it's good to know what the consequences are. One book that I some of you may remember, did any of you take my course in the Ten Commandments here? Well, I think those are mostly mostly college students. I studied the Ten Commandments, and uh, looking for what authors wrote, I found probably the best was by Charles Hodge, who was the president of Princeton Seminary in the 19th century, and he shows very clearly how the Ten Commandments interact with people and what their absence in non-Christian cultures produce. They have serious consequences for the way people act and the way they think. Um, it's been said that Darwin's ideas produced the last phase of a philosophical what shall I say, development that began with Descartes in the 18th century and continued down to the 19th century to people like Darwin, also people like Karl Marx. Um, but Darwin never claimed to be an atheist. In fact, atheism was beginning to arise, and some people wanted to cite Darwin. He was repeatedly asked by people who were fighting for an atheist cause to support their cause, and he always politely refused. He said he was an agnostic, not an atheist, and in his book on the descent of man, he shows that. Um, but he didn't believe in absolute moral values. And he didn't believe in a human soul. So a philosopher would say those are the two most important components. Do you have a soul? If so, then you can receive revolution from God. And you evaluate things on, is it a good idea to pickpocket people? It's not just a bad idea, it's morally wrong because it offends God. And I think I sometimes wish evangelical churches taught the Ten Commandments more, because they're not just short statements that you can teach your kids, but if you go into them deeply, they've been basic to Christian ethics for 2,000 years and for very, very good reasons. Well, um, some of the early supporters of Darwin refused to accept any argument that these were simply that there were moral values. They weren't moral values at all. And Darwin followed the evolutionary naturalists in discarding any belief in a soul. But he wasn't an atheist. Now, what were the arguments that were used against Darwin? That is the idea that human beings were descended from lower forms of animal life. One was a belief in God. If you don't have a soul, if you don't have any basis for moral values other than your own society, then a belief in God and the creation of the world goes by the way. And this was an argument that was set forth very clearly in a book written by Charles Hodge. Charles Hodge was the president of Princeton Seminary, which was the greatest evangelical seminary in the 19th century. Some very powerful theologians. And Hodge took up the cudgel, and he wrote a series of letters to Darwin. And in that age, in the 19th century, people were still polite. You could write letters to the man that you thought was wrong in many ways, but you carried on a courteous debate with him. And he wrote a book, What is Darwinism? It's a short book, and the answer is Darwinism is atheism. Now, remember, Darwin didn't claim to be an atheist. He claimed to be an agnostic. But Hodge said, if you accept Darwin's views about the origin of man, then you must become an atheist. If you rule God out of the picture in your science, rule out God out in a spiritual life as well. And he said God simply was nowhere to be found in Darwin, who always said, "Well, I'm an agnostic in that." And to him, that was the basis for the views that Darwin held. Um, and if you accept Darwin's theory, you accept his atheism as well. If you were um, clear in your thinking, because Darwin had completely cut God out of the picture, and that was stated very well. I've read, I think, um, Hodge's Systematic Theology in 3 volumes is one of the great systematic theology. You read it, haven't you? And he's got a whole section on the Ten Commandments. And when I offered my Sunday school class, much of my material came out of Hodge's 3rd volume on the Ten Commandments. He was a very great scholar and a very godly man. Um, and he said, if you accept Darwin, then you must, to be consistent, without a world of design or without any influence apart from God, you you become an atheist. Um, and he said, um, Charles Hodge said, a life that is devoid of any higher values is only based on human values. And who gives that to us? We give it to ourselves. I think in a few words, it probably sets it out very well. Now, there was another man who held many of the same ideas that Darwin. His name was Alfred Russel Wallace. He died in 1913. They knew each other. They were both naturalists. And Darwin had heard that he had arrived at the same ideas as Darwin, pretty well the same ideas. And scientists, and several of you are scientists, know that whoever gets there first gets the credit. That's not quite as true in history, but it's true in many fields. The scientist who publishes first his results is the one who's cited. So that forced Darwin into publishing probably a little earlier than he would have. And Wallace was an evolutionist like Darwin, but he's usually described as the co-discoverer of uh, of evolution, but he he believed that if you eliminated spiritual values, you made man a machine. He wasn't a Christian, but he was a man who believed in a providential God, and he believed that eternal values were the moral values which God had placed in the evolutionary chain as they were coming toward man. And There were a number of people, because these were debated mostly at first by theologians and philosophers. Um, Another distinguished person who supported evolution was Asa Gray. He taught at Harvard. He was a botanist, and he taught at Harvard, and he was one of the ardent defenders of evolution in America. But Gray was a Christian, and he couldn't believe that the universe, human beings, our eternal values could be the result of just chance. And that's what Darwin did. He made them the result of chance and struggle, as Darwin would say, the struggle for survival. That is, with the view of Malthus, everybody is looking to succeed, even to live, and we do that by the eternal struggle. And Gray was a Christian, and he believed in Christian values, and he couldn't believe that the universe was the product of just a chance and, as he would say, a struggle. So he carried on a debate with Darwin by letters. Um, he was in North America at Harvard, Darwin was in London, and over a long period of time, they carried on debates in letters. Not many people do that. They're anxious to get their views and published in print, and they didn't so much in that day. He argued that the idea of um, life as a product of chance and struggle were contrary to reason. He argued that God had intervened or carried on the struggle for life, as it was called, and he didn't believe that the universe, its creation of human life, could be the result of this struggle and just chance, because for Darwin it was a matter of chance. Um, he said it shows clear design in the way it happened. It's an indication of God's design in nature that he worked it out this way. Um, and he quoted scientific reasons. He was the best known botanist in the United States. He was a man who was greatly respected, and he said that the variation in each population has beneficial results. And he said the universe is moral, human beings have souls, and that the larger picture, which Darwin ignored, showed that both design in nature and eternal values in our hearts explain the way we act, the way we don't act. And Darwin's answer was pretty simple. There is no divine plan in the universe. It had no purpose. The universe is the result of blind chance. Those were the leading gods. Um, Among the many naturalists who accepted Darwin's theory, um, I'm sorry, excuse me, I should go back. Many scientists accepted Darwin's theory, but many didn't. It wasn't immediately accepted. And a famous person who didn't was St. George Jackson Mivart. He was a Roman Catholic. Um, he too pointed to the traditional views that were held by people since the early Christian era. There was a design in nature. Where would you find that in the Bible? I read the chapter the first time. Do you remember? Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. And he said, the world around us shows that it's operated not by chance, but by divine pattern. Even the lives of ordinary human beings, even the creation of society, shows that there are higher values in store and that they come from God. So he argued for um, divine design in nature. That was a common argument, and it had been since early Christian times. And that shows that there's a divine control over nature. Um, so he was he had an argumentative strain in his body, and he eventually was excommunicated by the Catholic Church, uh, not over Darwinianism, but other factors as well. But a number of people argued against Darwin. So a number of not just theologians um, like the Princetonians, but scientists like Navarre and others, Asa Gray, argued, well, they accepted evolution in some sense. They felt that it was robbed of any human design that would make it more than just a naturalistic evolutionary explanation. And these came to be known as theistic evolutionists. And they have been, if not a majority, certainly a strong minority in those who accepted evolution. Um, Evolutionists who are theistic are, for the most part, Christians. There's some Jews, but they're Christians, Protestant, Roman Catholic, and they argue that if you have an agnostic view as Darwin, you leave all morals out, or rather, the morals that you hold, you believe, came about by natural forces. And any Christian would say they don't come about by chance. They come about because there's a God who created a moral universe and has a divine plan. Um, and some of them believed that there was evidence for evolution, and so they adopted Lamarckian ideas. Lamarckian has always been thought popularly to have been disproved by Darwin, but it's always enjoyed an underground view, acquired characteristics, and today, when some Darwinism is breaking down, or at least calling for critics, some scientists have become Lamarckians. Um, well, okay, why am I spending so much time on this? I better look at my time. When does church start? At 10? 10:30. All right. Well, we have 15 or 20 minutes. Why do we spend so much time on Darwin? Because Darwin shaped the modern world in many respects. He shamed it. He established its basis in science, for example. It was also something that helped destroy a belief in divine morality. In the 19th century, virtually all Protestant Christians taught their kids the Ten Commandments. And if they were in Lutheran or Reformed churches that had a catechism, they had a good explanation for each of the Ten Commandments. I'm guessing that 90% of Americans in the 19th century believed in the Ten Commandments, and they believed that it was the order that God had created for a Christian world. Um, and Charles Hodge, who was the Princeton seminary president, had published his book, What is Darwinism? And he said Darwinism is atheism. If you accept the Darwinian view, then you will accept the absence of morals other than as human creation. Well, in the last half of the 19th century, you remember the Origin of Species was published in 1859. Most of the intellectual elites in Europe and America came to accept some form of Darwinism. They thought that it explained the universe, at least human life or animal life, better than another view. And in fact, many of them weren't very sure about what they believed, but whereas in the first few years, it took a while for naturalists and other scientists to accept Darwin, eventually in the last third of the 19th century, his views gained wide acceptance. And it not only gained acceptance in biology, but it became what we call an organizing idea, a belief in the evolution of science. And this was applied, for example, to anthropology. Anthropology today is virtually a Darwinian preserve. That was the case in the mid-19th century. Remember that many of the naturalists at Darwin's times came from what profession? So the clergy. Yes. Clerical naturalists disappeared because the professional biologists or naturalists got positions in universities and quickly or over time edged out the clerical naturalists in favor of Darwinians. Also, in science, any attempt to tie science to theology was done away with. If you were dealing with natural theology, you replaced any evidence of science pointing to God. So by the middle of the 19th century, the beginning of the end of the Christian domination of schools and universities had taken place. And by 1920, we'll say the end of the First World War, virtually all Christian education had been abolished in most Scottish universities and English universities, and very quickly were being replaced in American universities. And there's a secondary reason, and this almost deserves a lecture in itself, but we don't have time for that. Many of the 19th century academics from the Ivy League colleges and the leading colleges in the Eastern United States went to the country that offered the very best in university education at that time. Do you know where it was? Germany. Germany in the 19th century became the leader in university education. And if you wanted a PhD that was worth something, not many people in the 19th century got a PhD, but if you wanted to go to study with the best, you went to Germany. Where do you go today? The US, yes. Yeah, today, lots of people go to Germany, and Italy and other places, but yes, you go to the US, you assume that they have the leading universities. Hundreds and hundreds of the distinguished scholars of the 19th century who were Americans went to Germany. And in the last half of the 19th century, German theologians had mostly become liberal. I would say between 1850 and 1900, German universities, which had been orthodox in their theology in the first half of the century, became overwhelmingly liberal. And they had developed ideas about the naturalistic development of Israel's faith, which wasn't grounded in God's revelation, but was grounded in their picking up ideas from their non-Jewish neighbors. So people who began to teach at Yale and Harvard, the leading universities all over the Eastern United States, if you wanted the top flight degree, you went for your Doctor of Philosophy to Germany. And they brought home German um, liberal ideas. And by 1920, most of the leading universities, including many church universities in the eastern United States, had become the leaders of theology were hardly Christians. Some of them were, they hid their atheism, but they were atheist. And the whole idea of the revolutionary views of the Bible, the natural criticism of the Bible, came to America in the latter half of the 19th century and up through the 1920s. So Harvard, Yale, not Princeton, but Harvard, Yale, most of the Eastern universities became liberal. Where did the best American ministers want to go to university? If you were anywhere in the United States and you wanted a top flight degree, you went to Harvard or a similar view, a similar institution. And what kind of theology did you pick up? The best German theology of the late 19th century. And it wasn't orthodox, it wasn't evangelical. Much of it was all but atheistic. And that, by the way, is how modernism spread so quickly in the large American denominations between, I would say, 1890 and 1920. By 1920, all the universities in the eastern United States, all the theological faculties had become liberal. And that spread throughout the Midwest from the University of Chicago. They spread, which was deliberately secular, they spread to Midwestern views. So how is it that by, let's say, 1945 or so, the large denominations, virtually all the large denominations in the United States had become theologically liberal? It was because they had gotten their ideas from German universities, the higher criticism, and had spread it to American ministerial candidates and biblical scholars. And it was only a small number of evangelical divinity schools that had managed to avoid that. So, and Darwinism was a part of that change. Darwin had shown how in evolutionary ways you could change ideas and the like. So Darwin indirectly influenced, say, theological education, but it was mostly the higher criticism of the Bible, which had begun in Germany in the mid-19th century, which carried the day to modernize American institutions. And finally, and with this I have to close, evolutionary theories also provided a basis for the development of religion. It was a natural belief in revelation. Is there a theistic God who reveals himself to human beings? Well, not if you believe in deism or some form of that. So how do you explain Israel's faith in the Old Testament? Well, you apply an evolutionary approach to it. Jews started out with animism. They gradually changed their views over time and eventually came to ethical monotheism in very late second Isaiah, which was divided into two halves, and second Isaiah has a higher view of God. So if you wonder, why did this change so late? Well, it was because America was relatively protected from Darwinian ideas and from natural ideas in theology, I would say until the very late 19th and early 20th century, and overlaps with some of your what shall I say, your own personal history. And Darwin's idea was very influential in the natural view that all religion, being a human construct, remember, none of it's by divine inspiration, all of religion had developed. And there were people in Germany and later in America who went through stages, animism, deism, monotheism. In case you hadn't read A Higher Critic, the monotheism wasn't necessarily ethical monotheism. That came later. So if you read, I read this stuff in high school. A lot of radical books, leftist books would say, First Isaiah was written by somebody who held traditional ideas. Beginning in chapter 40 and on, second Isaiah, we know it was written by Isaiah, they would say. And Isaiah shows ethical monotheism, monotheism of supernatural belief, which is joined with ethical beliefs based on that. So all that was the result of changes that were going on in the European world in the late 19th century and introduced by Americans who studied in Europe and brought them back, from, we'll say, 1890 to 1920. By 1920, virtually all leading American universities had been taken over by people who held those views. Now, evangelicals sometimes make this sound like it was an attempt to burrow under ordinary things. It wasn't. There was nothing in mind that was of the nature of attempting to subvert ideas. It was people believed that these were the ideas that had been demonstrated by a whole variety of people, by Darwin, who had shown that there is no supernatural element. It all comes by a naturalistic explanation. Was there a God? Well, Darwin said, I don't know, maybe not. But it didn't change the nature of the theology. And then ideas in philosophy that had developed mostly in France, added to that, made a naturalistic view of theology the basis of liberal theology in America. That happened, I would say, over 30 or 40 years, say between 1890 and 1930 or 40. By the late 20s, there was only one of the great theological faculties in the East that had been solidly evangelical in the 19th century. Only one left that was still Orthodox. What was that, Mike? Princeton. Yes. It was, and that produced a split in which J. Gresham Machen took four of his colleagues and they left Princeton because the last of the solid evangelical seminaries had become, it didn't go liberal over a year, it took 40 or 50 years because it was the most conservative. But one by one, the universities and even the theological seminaries fell. And I could carry this on. I'll just finish up by saying, why is it that eventually that the evangelical group left the major seminaries? It was because they had become liberal. In American Baptist, the American Baptist seminaries had already, by the late 19th century, begun that road. So the first schism from the American Baptist Convention occurred in 1922-23. That was the regular Baptists. And the second one occurred in, was it 46? Yeah. When a second large group left the American Baptist Convention, and it was over liberalism. Now, is Darwin to blame for all this? No, but he introduced a naturalism in philosophy and biology that seemed very attractive to people because it was new learning. New learning is always attractive, isn't it? I mean, sometimes I'm surprised, I shouldn't be, but surprised to see that some new discovery in some obscure field of science makes the headlines. Why? Because we still trust science as the guardian of the basic understanding that we have of the world. And so we want to see what's new. But it was Darwin who began what led to other fields. And if we had time, I'd talk about the Darwinian influence on genetics, on a whole variety of things, even in medicine, because he started a major movement and it's moved through several others. Well, I'm sorry, this has been too lengthy, but I wanted to take a whole hour because I wanted to show that Darwin, even though he was a biologist, discovered ideas that led to almost all fields. So I sometimes hear somebody talk about the evolution of something, modern thought, or the evolution of chess or something. I say, is chess a science? Does it evolve? But it's become a word that we use for all major changes in all major areas. So the Darwinian influence, was it large? Was it widespread? Yes, it helped make the world of thought and science and religion that we live in today. Let's close in prayer, shall we? Father, we thank you for the ability to talk about these things in church. And although I haven't spent much time talking about scripture, we see that the effect of Darwin was, in a sense, that he hadn't intended, even brought into biblical theology, biblical writings, and a whole variety of other things. I pray, our Father, that you might give us the ability to sort out truth from falsehood, to find in evolutionary or development ideas some things that might be worthwhile, other things that are dangerous to ideas. We have to be We have to be wise. We have to master your word and its teaching in a whole variety of ways. So we pray that you will be with us as we go into worship. We pray that our hearts might be quiet before you, and that we will give our devotion for this time to you and your word and to praising you. In Jesus' name, amen.